So I do a lot of combing through the motorsport history books to try and find stuff that's interesting and gets you thinking, because it's all well and good doing the stuff that you know about and the stuff that you've heard about, but the stuff that gets you thinking, that's the stuff I really enjoy doing. And the best kickstarters for these get you thinking types of videos usually come from the Motorsport magazine archive. Usually it's something that starts off with a question like, was this car better than we thought it was? Was this race this driver's best Grand Prix? And because they're written by somebody who was there at that event or in that time frame, you get an insight into how stuff was there and then. I can then go out and look at the facts and stats, compare them to what that particular person said at that time, and get this thing going of, alright, this happened, this led to this, then this, and this, and this, and this, and so on. And I did this last week with the Robert Kubica video. That 2010 season of his in that Renault was utterly mental, and we all forget about it because we were too busy watching Vettel, Webber, Alonso, Button and Hamilton. But while getting my $5.99 a month's worth from my Motorsport magazine subscription, I came across an interesting question. Is Mika Hakkinen one of the greatest drivers ever? Okay, some of you are already going to be saying no, because Schumacher, Hamilton, Fangio, Senna, Prost, Lauda, Stewart, Clark and Graham Hill already exist. Hamilton with 105 wins, Schumacher 91, Vettel 53, Prost 51, they all demolish Hakkinen with wins and championships. But Mika's achievements are made more impressive when you consider one thing. The bloke came this close to dying, so this is how Mika Hakkinen went from talented upstart that beat Senna in his first qualifying session to almost dying in an Adelaide hospital to world champion. Like most drivers, Hakkinen had come up through the junior categories, and I say most because a few drivers around that time hadn't come up in what we'd consider the traditional manner. I think it was either Warwick or Blundell that started on motocross bikes rather than karts, and then later Damon Hill would come through having never sat in a kart in his life. Hakkinen would win the 1990 British Formula 3 Championship, which at the time was highly prestigious, and was a season he utterly dominated, with fellow Finn Mika Salo finishing in second. He finished first or second in all but 3 races, a third at Silverstone, a retirement at Silverstone later in the season, and a 6th at Donington. And from there it was straight up into Formula 1 with the on its last legs Lotus team. The downfall of Lotus has already been documented on the channel, and it's sad to see them deteriorate in the way that they did after their boss, founder, visionary and everything else, Colin Chapman, died in 1982. But despite Lotus not being in the best of shape around this time, Hakkinen was able to pull some results out of the bag in 1991 and was the only permanent driver for Lotus that season, as Lotus had 3 other drivers in the car, Julian Bailey, Johnny Herbert and Michael Bartels. Hakkinen made the grid every single race that season, with the exception of the French Grand Prix, where he was outside the top 26. So with a car that was slow or falling apart, falling apart, that's Lotus tradition, isn't it? Hakkinen was still able to score points. Bailey also scored a point at Imola, but that was the only race he qualified for, and then had to be dumped from the team due to lack of funding, hence Herbert and Bartels. Herbert, who also needs a video doing considering what happened to him at Brands Hatch in the juniors, would float around the top 10, close to points today, but not back then. But both drivers not doing bad considering the equipment they'd got. 1992, it was the same car, as Lotus didn't really have the funds to build a brand new one in time for the start of the season. Hakkinen and Herbert had to start off with a modified version of the 102, the 102D, with the team using a BBC show aimed at kids called Record Breakers to try and drum up some sponsorship. They basically took the 102D to Brands in an attempt at breaking the lap record, which Herbert did. With a better car underneath him, Hakkinen scored points more regularly. He and Herbert had scored a 6th place, Herbert in South Africa and Mika in Mexico, but after that, Hakkinen was able to score way more often once the 107 arrived. While it would break down for him on a few occasions, it didn't break down anywhere near as much as it did with Herbert, and with 5 point scores in it, plus the points at Mexico, it was a decent enough haul, with 2 4th places to boot at France and Hungary. A better car, and this kid should be going places. At least you'd think so. You might argue that should have been the case for 1993 when he signed for McLaren, but it wouldn't be. Michael Andretti, another driver we've already looked at in this growing list of driver and team lookbacks, was signed, and with the uncertainty over Senna going or not going, when it was all tied down for the season, Hakkinen was going to have to sit on the sidelines. Despite being just the test driver, Hakkinen was entered into a Porsche Super Cup race card at that year's Monaco Grand Prix, where he won both races from pole position. Now, to be fast in single-seaters is one thing. To be fast in single-seaters and tin tops, the latter of which you don't have much experience in, that's good going. Not many drivers have shown that recently. Who's gone from single seats to tin tops, or gone from tin tops to single seaters and been as good in one as they have been in the other immediately? I can only really think of Scott McLaughlin, but that's just my brain. It's quite smooth. Hakkinen would get his break at the Portuguese Grand Prix when Andretti went back to America. At this race, he did the unthinkable and outqualified Senna, but his race ended with a crash into a wall. The following race at Suzuka, he beat Senna to a podium, with Senna famously punching Eddie Irvine after the race. Ron Dennis and the rest of the McLaren staff must have been wondering what might have been if Hakkinen had been in the car instead of Andretti. But still, Hakkinen's seat was safe. He signed a new contract at the start of 1994 to take him through to the end of 1997. But any hopes of 1994 being as good or better than 1993 quickly evaporated. For this year, McLaren had Peugeot engines which weren't exactly great. In fact, they were worse than the Ford engines they had the previous year, and there's also the what if with the Lambo engines they tested at the end of 1993. Add to this, Senna had finally ditched McLaren to get the Williams drive he so desperately wanted, but all that ended in tragedy at Imola. So with an underpowered car and all that stuff, McLaren was also in grief because of the death of one of its legendary drivers. To add to this, Mika had a new teammate in Martin Brundle, and in the words of F1's most expert, they didn't get along too well, with Brundle admitting later on that it was probably his fault. But still, with the two drivers being completely different personalities, neither of them was Senna, and that didn't help McLaren either. And the on-track Mika was quiet, to the point where people thought he might be a bit dumb, in a way. But he was far from it, and the way that Finnish translates to English sometimes didn't help when trying to get technical with the whole setting up of the car. But during 1994, Mika had some moments that those who mainly saw his later McLaren years might not be familiar with. He was involved in a couple of very silly moments. The first being at Silverstone, where he made the podium at the expense of Barrichello by basically firing him off the road, and as a result of the collision, he was given a one-race ban that was suspended for 3 races. At the very next Grand Prix in Germany, where his later great rival Michael Schumacher was racing under appeal for stuff he'd done at the British Grand Prix, Mika wiped out most of the grid into Turn 1. With the FIA close to shooting their own shadows at this point, given what had happened at Imola, Monaco and Lami's testing accident at Silverstone, they weren't playing games. It was a one-race ban for Mika. On his return, Mika seemed a bit more chill. He scored a second place at the Belgian Grand Prix, which was originally third, but Michael had been disqualified, and then he scored 3 more thirds in a row, which wasn't bad considering the car being what it was that year. He couldn't score in Japan or Australia, but he was 4th in the driver's standings on 26 points. It was only 10 more than Brundle scored that season. Brundle did get 2 podiums himself, his best result of the season also being 2nd place, which he took at Monaco, but both drivers that year were absolutely mullered by reliability, and Mika also copping that ban for what happened in Germany. Every race Mika finished bar the last 2 races, he finished on the podium. But that said, Brundle also finished every single race bar 2 in the points. The two weren't separated by that much when you think about it. Given the equipment they had, they did pretty well. And I'm using the teammates as the comparisons for this, because as David Coulthard has said multiple times, your first opponent is your teammate. I look at the 2 drivers within the team to see what's what, because they have the same car, and sometimes one driver will be doing out of this world stuff in something awful, while the other isn't doing as well. In this case, Hakkinen and Brundle were pretty evenly matched. I don't think Brundle gets that much credit when he should. I also think it's a bit harsh that Barrichello has a did not qualify next to him for Imola. At the very least, it should be a withdrawn. But when you look at that 1994 Drivers' Championship standings again, it makes for quite uncomfortable reading when you see that only 3 drivers in the top 10 did the entire season, whereby they started every single Grand Prix. Those 3 drivers were Hill, Brundle and Berger. 1995 and problems at McLaren persist. However, McLaren now had Mercedes power, and Mercedes had come in with some intent after being with Sauber for a few years. It would also mean McLaren had their 3rd engine supplier in as many seasons, and on top of this, Mansell had been coaxed out of retirement, but both Mansell and Hakkinen were having problems fitting in the car. Mansell more so than Mika. So Mansell was moved aside for Mark Blundell. But 1995 wasn't as good for Mika as 1994 had been. While he had scored at the Brazilian and San Marino Grand Prix, it would not be until Belgium that he'd score again, with 7 retirements being split up with a 7th in France. He would be 2nd in Italy and was then 8th at the Nürburgring, before having to miss the Pacific Grand Prix because he was having his appendix out. A podium at Suzuka followed, but then at Adelaide, Formula 1 was on tenterhooks. Heading to Brewery Corner at the Adelaide street circuit, Hakkinen lost control due to a tyre failure. Brewery Corner was the fastest corner on the track, and the FIA hadn't quite standardised curb heights yet, so his out-of-control McLaren spun round, hit the curb and was launched into the air. Hakkinen hit the wall at about 120 miles an hour, and because the FIA hadn't also mandated the high cockpit size yet, and the HANS device was about 8 years away, Hakkinen suffered horrendous injuries, including a skull fracture. Thankfully, 2 doctors were in the crowd at that corner, Jerome Cockings and Steve Lewis, and they rushed to the scene to administer emergency first aid. It just so happened that the hospital they worked at was literally half a mile from the crash site. Cockings performed an emergency tracheotomy so Mika could breathe, and when Sid Watkins arrived, all he had to do was supervise, as these 2 doctors had it all under control and they were doing things properly. While tending to Hakkinen, they had to restart his heart. Twice. He would be in hospital for 2 months as he recovered in what he calls excruciating pain from the fractured skull. He later said in an interview with Steve Ryder for the Sky F1 channel that getting back into a car wasn't the first thing that he was thinking about, like how Billy Munger and Alex Zanardi were thinking about getting back into a car. He just wanted to live and for the pain to go away, because as he said, cracking your skull, it's not fun, and being subjected to test after test after test after test also wasn't fun. And to think this was in 1995 when CTE wasn't really a known thing and WWE, ECW wrestlers were quite happily smacking each other in the face with steel chairs and putting people through tables and doing other bits and pieces that are just completely off limits today. And also the Rugby Football Union and the National Football League not having the concussion protocols that they have today. So everything that Hakkinen was having done to him at this hospital in Adelaide was, well, quite modern, really. But despite focusing on living rather than racing, Mika was going to be back in time for 1996. For the first time in his career, he had a teammate with less experience, with David Coulthard joining him from Williams. And just to be safe, Ron Dennis called on Alain Prost to do the initial test runs in the MP411. But when Mika did get back in the car just 3 months after the accident, it was like he'd never been away. The car was a marked improvement on 1995. It did initially ship with some handling issues, but these were tuned out in time for San Marino, where Coulthard defied everybody's expectations to lead the opening 19 laps of the race. Hakkinen, though, still outpaced and outscored his teammate, doing so for the 3rd time in as many years, with consistent points finishes and 4 podiums. Coulthard, though, did have more problems in the way of retirements, but even then he was still being outpaced, with McLaren looking forward to 1997. But 1997 was completely the opposite to 1996 for Mika though. While Coulthard and Hakkinen both had 7 retirements each, Coulthard had 2 wins to Hakkinen's 1, which was gifted to him at the final race at Jerez. But Hakkinen had been in several positions to score big or even take a win before his McLaren conked out on him, and was then disqualified from the Belgian Grand Prix for using illegal fuel. At Silverstone, the A1 Ring and the Nürburgring, he'd been leading before his McLaren broke down, losing him a potential 30 points. He could have been in the 50s for points scored as opposed to the 27 that he did get. But for 1998, his McLaren would have the name of one of the best to ever pick up a pencil. Nui. The MP413 was utterly dominant in the opening rounds of the 1998 season. The narrow track groove tyre era had begun, and with the 13 having some Nui input, it scored a 1-2 with Hakkinen and Coulthard in the opening 2 rounds, and at both of those races they were the only 2 cars on the lead lap. They were, in part, helped by the second brake pedal that McLaren claimed was worth half a second, before it was banned due to a Ferrari protest. That's a video I need to revisit, as it so happens. At the Argentine Grand Prix, Goodyear brought some better tyres and Ferrari closed the gap, with Hakkinen and Schumacher beginning a 3-year rivalry. Schumacher and Hakkinen were the class of the field in 1998, Ferrari having brought their own upgrades and now had a car capable of challenging for a title. But both drivers suffered 3 retirements over the course of the season, with Hakkinen bidding the car in front of the Tifosi at Imola and retiring in Canada, with both Schumacher and Hakkinen retiring in Belgium. I'm trying to see where gains were made by Hakkinen here, winning in Australia when Schumacher retired and gaining another 10 points in Monaco when Michael was 10th. But whenever Michael won, Mika always scored, at least when he finished, which kept him in the title fight. Mika's best race of the season and probably the best of his career was the race at the Nürburgring. Both he and Schumacher had come into that race on 80 points, so whoever outscored the other would have the advantage going towards the final round at Suzuka. During the race, Irvine held Mika up while Schumacher romped off into the distance, but Hakkinen was able to overtake Irvine into the chicane. He then caught up to Schumacher, overcut him during the pit stops, and in the final stages of the Grand Prix started to pull away to take the win, the 10 points, and have the advantage. At Suzuka, he took his first title, a season finale that will always go down as one of the most topsy-turvy. 2 aborted starts, Schumacher dumped to the back of the grid, and then Mika leading lights to flag while Schumacher got a puncture from driving over debris from a collision. Hakkinen had gone from rapid, talented upstart to almost being killed to world champion. A very up and down career. But in 1999 though, he was going to have it even harder. The McLaren in 1999 was fragile, and without Michael's leg break at Silverstone, the title might have been Schumacher's. But McLaren and Ferrari both dropped the ball hard this season, with the cynics among you about to tell me that Ferrari did it on purpose because they couldn't have Eddie Irvine winning the title before Schumacher could. Either way though, it was a weird season, with the points tally for the winner being just 76 points, which might be the lowest of the 15 years prior to this particular season. Still though, Hakkinen demolished Coulthard, who had slipped to 4th in the standings behind Irvine and Frentzen, with Frentzen being a dark horse for 1999. In 2000 it took a while for him to get going, retiring from the opening 2 rounds of the season and then took his first win of the season in Spain. While he did score heavily from there on, Ferrari and Schumacher still had the edge, with Mika clawing back enough to be within a chance of winning the title. He actually led the championship going into the US Grand Prix. But at that US Grand Prix at Indianapolis, an engine failure lost him enough points for Michael to finally take a title with Ferrari. That year also had the most famous moment of that 3-year rivalry, or 4-year rivalry if you want to include 2001, which we'll get to in a second. It was that overtake on the Kemmel Straight. On one lap, Schumacher defended hard, putting Hakkinen onto the grass. A lap later, or 2 laps later, I can't remember when, I probably should have watched the clip, Hakkinen used the slipstream of both Schumacher and Zonta to overtake into Les Combes. And in the interview afterwards, he was describing what happened, and he said, "Yes, I overtook the BAR, and I also overtook the Michael." And that's where we get the term. During 2001 though, Mika announced he would be going on a sabbatical for 2002, saying that he wanted to spend more time with his family. His son Hugo was barely a year old at this point, and like Damon Hill before him, it might have triggered something in his head. Also like how Max Chilton stopped doing ovals after his kid was born, and Romain Grosjean not wanting to do them in the wake of his accident in Bahrain. But through 2001 it was clear something wasn't right with him. He'd slowed down quite a bit. Coulthard obliterated him in the standings, and the reliability of that year's McLaren wasn't great either, losing a win on the final lap of the Spanish Grand Prix. But after 2 world championships, battling Schumacher and Ferrari for all that time, it might have taken its toll. At Melbourne he'd crashed heavily when his suspension failed, and this was adding to a suspension failure that caused another hefty shunt at the 1999 German Grand Prix. So with those 2 crashes in mind, plus his son, plus family, and also the head injury, at that point he probably went, "Yeah, I need a break." And so he did. His sabbatical became full-time retirement in 2002, and when he announced that sabbatical, Michael Schumacher himself said that he was going to miss him, calling him the only driver he ever feared racing against, words that have since been attached to Mika Hakkinen every single time. It's always Mika Hakkinen, 2-time Formula 1 world champion and the only driver Michael Schumacher feared, words that have since been attached to Mika Hakkinen every single time. It's always Mika Hakkinen, 2-time Formula 1 world champion and the only driver Michael Schumacher feared. Now you could go your whole career and only win a handful of races. You could go your whole career and not win a title. But if you've got that title of the only driver the Michael feared, you've done something right with your time in the sport. Hakkinen versus Schumacher was better than Villeneuve versus Schumacher, or Hill versus Schumacher. When it was Hakkinen against the Michael, at least in 1998 and 2000, the playing field was largely even. I say this because in 1994 Michael had his race bans. In 1995 Williams essentially handed the title to Michael on a plate. 1997 Williams should have won it by more than they actually did, and Michael was later kicked out, and then in 1999 Schumacher broke his leg. In 1998 and 2000 the playing field was even. It was 2 drivers doing it mostly on track than picking up scraps from retirements and bits and pieces like that, and the cars were relatively even too. It was like the last scraps of the on-track battles that we reminisce about with the likes of Prost and Senna, or Hunt and Lauda, Villeneuve and Pironi, kicking 7 colours out of each other for the championship. Hakkinen was always the bet for qualifying, Schumacher for the race, but if you needed a driver to keep his cool under pressure, such as Nürburgring 98 or Suzuka 99, you'd take Hakkinen. Schumacher was a thinking driver, Hakkinen more of an instinctive driver. Martin Brundle, who was teammates with both of them, said that the 3 best drivers that he ever raced against were Senna, Schumacher and Hakkinen, in that order. In terms of natural talent, he'd put Hakkinen above Schumacher, but in terms of an overall package, the Michael pips him. I don't think many modern F1 fans will realise how rapid Hakkinen was. Some might dismiss him because of Schumacher's statistics, some might just call him a Nui merchant, but in their overall delivery the two were very similar. Perhaps that's why Michael feared him. Hakkinen was one of my 4 guys growing up, with Montoya, Hill and Raikkonen, and if you were to play a word association game where you give me a team and I have to name a driver, if you were to say McLaren, chances are I'm going to say Hakkinen before Hunt, Hamilton or even Senna, because that's how much of my early F1 viewing years Hakkinen was. Hakkinen and Coulthard are still McLaren to me, because of, they were like the dream team, if you want to call them that. What do you think? Do people sleep on Hakkinen too much, or was he really one of those 2 very good seasons and then bust types of drivers? Or did he do alright considering, the whole head injury thing? Let me know down in the comments and get a discussion going. So then, a look at the life and times of the Lord of Sisu himself, Mika Hakkinen. If you have great memories of the guy and have been given food for thought by this video, then do like it so I know a good job was done. And for more stuff like this, get subscribed and get the bell on so you never miss out on anything I do around here. Massive thanks as ever to the mad lads at Patreon that continue to support me at a more personal level. And if you want to help keep things running around here, a link to Patreon is in the description, along with links to Discord, socials, affiliates and other bits and bobs you might want or need to know. Or there's super thanks down there if you want to buy me a coffee, and also memberships if Patreon isn't your thing. So until next time, I've been AdmiralLaWind, have a great day wherever you are, and goodbye.